thank you very much for joining us this evening. This week, in fact, for the last 2 weeks, we've had quite a lot of interest in a proposal to turn over some of the Hagley Park area opposite the hospital for car parking. But joining me on the line now from Hands Off Hagley is Meehan, and he's got some fairly clear views on this. Good evening, Martin.
Good evening. Yeah, I'm not sure whether I have clear views. I'd have to say I'm neither for or against anything till I see the whole proposal.
Okay,
it's certainly not up.
In terms of the using some of the park for parking opposite the hospital, I imagine that you'd be against that.
Personally, I would say no to that. But it's, as I say, it's not up to me. I don't get to say what happens in the park or doesn't happen in the park. What happens in the park is controlled by a specific bit of legislation called the Hagley Park Management Plan. Nothing can happen in the park that fails to comply with the management plan, and it's a statutory document. And just to reinforce that, Meehan Woods, in Parliament in the last government session, she had a motion passed unanimously through Parliament to strengthen the Hagley Park Management Plan and just reinforce that nothing could happen without it. So, anything that I would say as far as I don't want this or I think it's a great idea is just a bit of opinion. Because unless something complies with that, I'm afraid you run into a brick wall there.
Okay, what happened with the cricket oval proposal? Because there was some opposition towards that, wasn't there?
Yes. And that, by the way, doesn't comply and never complied. But it fell in that little sort of magic window where we had Sarah running the place, and their legislation was deemed to have overruled the Hagley Park Management Plan, so it was allowed to go through. And the judge in that case said if it was tried under the Hagley Park Management Plan, it wouldn't have happened. So it's one of those quirky things, but it's gone through with a lot of restrictions, and yeah. They're still trying to remove a lot of the restrictions, but now they have to deal with the Hagley Park Management Plan.
Okay, I'm speaking with
that's an ongoing fight.
I'm speaking with Martin Meehan, who's very kindly joined us. Are you spokesperson for the Hands Off Hagley, or do you run it, or what's the situation?
No, I'm just a spokesperson. I was the one who put my hand up and said, okay, I'll be the spokesperson. If anybody else wants to do the job, they can. But everybody has different jobs within the group. I mean, we have planners and a couple of legal people, that sort of thing. So they said, you go to it, and so that's me.
So the oval clearly didn't fit within the plan, yet it was still allowed to go ahead. Was that because Sarah had emergency powers at the time?
Yes.
Oh, that's interesting.
That's what the judge found. They found that the Sarah legislation overruled the Hagley Park Management Plan.
So the oval's there now. It's been there for some time.
The oval is there under very strict conditions.
I think it kind of fits in quite well. I mean, because a lot of the park is tasked with sports and recreation use anyway.
Mm. Yeah, it's no doubt about it. It's a beautiful cricket oval, but I think one of the objections we had at that stage was that it's like a foot in the door, and as you let somebody in, then their little empire starts to grow and grow, and then you have a part of Hagley Park that is virtually annexed off, and it becomes not available to anybody else. And a lot of people would say, well, nobody uses that corner. The same, I guess, is what they're saying about putting a car park in the hospital corner.
Actually, we've got a map of the park with a little wee outline on it. We'll just see if we can bring it up again. Just to remind you, if you just joined us, I'm speaking with Martin Meehan from Hands Off Hagley. There's a ringed off area in red with a white sort of rendering of where the car park might be. I think it would probably be a bit bigger than that. What about if they were able to excavate that, put a car park underground, and then reinstate the park on top of it? How would you feel about that?
Well, that's interesting. And once again, you'd have to see the whole proposal, because if it complies, then it's only after that it becomes a matter of opinion, and my opinion is as good as anybody else's. But bear in mind that if you went underground, how deep do you go underground? I'm just throwing a couple of things out here.
Well, I would imagine it would have to be. You've probably got to park about 2,000 cars in there, so it would be 2 or 3 stories. So you're going down 40 or 50 feet. I would have thought.
Yeah. So how you protect that from flooding, I'm not sure. But the integrity of the park itself, which is what we're keen on, and which is what the Hagley Park Management Plan is very keen on, is that you can't intrude into the park with anything. So if you've got an underground car park, for instance, I would imagine, something that size, you'd have to have some kind of ventilation system, would you?
Well, of course you would.
Well, where would the extraction things be?
Those are engineering challenges, which I'm sure they'd be able to meet.
So, you have to see what people are proposing, but also around the outside of the park, people they see them, they just take it for granted. But one of the features of the park, and this is, these trees are actually protected, is the integrity of the park has a border of mature trees around the edge. So if you're having people driving into, say, an underground park, where do they drive in? Because if you chew through the trees to get into the underground park, then you've affected the integrity of the park, and you've affected the amenity values of the park, which sounds a bit waffly, but it's very, very important.
Well, I think if they were going to do it, they'd just go under the trees. It's not a big deal.
Well, that's what people would say, but you take, half a dozen trees out here and half a dozen trees out there, and, pretty soon, as I say, you've got no trees. And that's why people are so passionate about the park. If we don't protect it, then there's nothing left for our grandchildren.
Well,
everybody's got a good idea for the park.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Can we just have a look at the retasking of things that have been given to the city before? I believe Edmonds gave the bandstand to the city, but that became, the rotunda there became a business. How did you feel about that?
I thought that was brilliant. I actually, before they even changed it to a restaurant, I remember sitting by the side of the river with my wife and saying, they should put a restaurant in there, because obviously there's no bands playing in there anymore. And they did, and it flourished for a while. So I was quite happy about that. We still had the building, it was being used. It's good.
Okay, so how did things... Oh, well, yes, that's the thing I wanted to ask you. I'm not sure about this, but prior to the earthquakes, wasn't there a public car park building for the hospital with some kind of underground access, and now that no longer exists? So what happened there? Do you know about that?
Yep. I've had personal experience of that. I had my son in intensive care for a wee while, and we were doing trips to the hospital all hours of the day and night. And it was amazing, the sorts of people you saw shuffling along that underground passageway under the road. And it was a bonus just to be able to do that. But of course now you can't do that. And yet the hospital's bigger and there's more staff. And you would think that was the plan. Didn't anybody think of parking? And particularly for a lot of the people that have to get there, and they're not always in great condition. So it is just, it's beyond belief that in all the grand plans we had for Christchurch, nobody thought of putting a parking building or put some sort of parking facility in the hospital.
Well, clearly there used to be a parking building that was tasked.
Yes, they did.
And for some reason, commercial considerations overrode that. Now, we're hoping to have Jerry Brownlee, who was the minister responsible for CERA, on with us next week to explain what the thinking was at the time. So I'm hoping that you can...
I don't think there was any. The tunnel itself is still there.
Yeah.
Now, you're talking about undergrounding a car park in Hagley Park. Well, then you've got to build quite a tunnel under that road and into the hospital. And believe me, that in itself is a major engineering undertaking.
But you have said quite clearly
pipes under the road.
We do need a hospital. We do need parking. It's not just for the patients.
We
there are about 1,000 staff, I think, or maybe about 500 to 1,000 staff on a waiting list, because some of them can park, and it doesn't cost too much. There's a camera that records the use of the car park, through license plate going in and out. But there aren't sufficient spaces for the staff, let alone the public. Okay.
Well, the other thing. I mean, I don't want to bang the old drum or anything, but with the cricket oval where it is, at various times, parking is an absolute premium there. And, if you've got a sick relative or you're injured and having to hobble into the hospital from a couple of blocks away, it's not a lot of fun. And, there was no thought given to that either. I remember at the Environment Court, cricket were asked, did you talk to the hospital before you went ahead with your plan? And they said, no, they didn't contact them at all. So there was, it's just par for the course. There's no consultation between a lot of people. But we've got the situation we have, I guess, and you would hope there's a solution somewhere.
Well, there'll be obviously opinions divided, but I'm sure people appreciate the guardianship role that you've taken on for one of the city's most important assets.
It's not like we're self-appointed sheriffs of Hagley Park. We just you've got the legislation which is there, which has to be followed, and that's it. So as long as everything's followed, that's fine. It's where we get upset, I guess, is if somebody tries to sneak something in that doesn't actually comply, and particularly people within the city council who ignore the rules and try and fudge things a little bit. And these people get paid a lot of money to actually look after the park. They should be the ones that jump up and down, not us.
Okay, well, Martin, thank you so much for joining us this evening. And we await developments on this with interest. That's great.
Okay.
Good evening to you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Well, good on Martin there. Who's he happens to be the proprietor and owner of Kids Cakes. So pop in there and grab a pie and say hello to Martin, and you can exchange your views, no doubt, with him or with us. Call After Dark on 027 257 9672.